Why do you keep asking whether all things are possible, while still imagining that the power that makes them possible is somewhere outside you? That is the contradiction almost no one sees. You say you believe that with God all things are possible. You may even repeat it with conviction. You may nod when you hear it. You may feel comforted by it. But then, almost in the same breath, you place God at a distance. You speak of power as though it belongs to something beyond you, above you, around you, watching you, but not being you. And that is where the division begins, not in reality, but in assumption. Because the moment you separate yourself from the source, you also separate yourself from creation. You begin to live as someone who must ask, wait, hope, deserve, prove. You become a spectator standing before life, rather than the one from whom life takes its shape. But what if that distance is the dream? What if the power you have been praying to is the very awareness through which you pray? Then everything changes, not gradually, not symbolically, fundamentally, because now the question is no longer whether God can do all things. The question becomes, what are you assuming now as the one in whom that power lives? This is where most people hesitate. They are willing to admire truth from afar. They are less willing to embody it. They will accept that imagination is powerful, but they will still treat it like fantasy. They will use it as escape, not as cause. They will visit a desired life in passing, then return to the old state as though the visit meant nothing. And then they wonder why nothing changes. But imagination is not a daydream. It is not an ornament of the mind. It is the creative center itself. The inner world is not a private theater with no consequence. It is the mold. The outer world is the cast. Reality does not argue with you. It simply echoes what you are being. That is why the deepest transformation is never behavioral at first. It is identitarian. You do not begin by changing circumstances. You begin by changing the one to whom those circumstances appear. You begin by asking a more dangerous question than, what do I want? You begin by asking, who am I being while I want it? Because wanting has a feeling, and so does being. Wanting says, it is not here yet. It is not mine yet. I am not that yet. Being says, this is settled within me, whether or not the world has caught up. That difference seems small to the surface mind. But it is the difference between chasing a shadow and becoming the source of the image. If it were already yours, how would you feel? Not tomorrow. Not after proof. Now. Would there be strain? Would there be pleading? Would there be that subtle inner panic that keeps checking the world for movement? No. There would be a kind of inward rest, not passivity, not laziness, but certainty, a quiet occupancy of a state already assumed. This is why feeling is the secret. Not emotion in the shallow sense, not excitement for a moment, but the inward sense of reality. The mood of already being, the naturalness of identification. To assume is to enter. To persist is to remain. To remain is to become. And to become inwardly is to compel the outer world to reflect it. Most people reverse the order. They wait for the mirror to smile before they smile. They wait for the world to confirm a state before they dare inhabit it. But the mirror has never been the origin. It has always been the reflection. The outer world has no choice but to arrange itself around the role you are inwardly playing. Because the world is not separate from consciousness, it is consciousness made visible. What are you assuming right now? Not what do you say you want? Not what do you wish were true? What are you actually assuming? Are you assuming that life is difficult for you? That love passes you by? That money comes slowly? That success belongs to others? That opportunities arrive for people more connected, more gifted, more fortunate? Then do not be surprised when the world, obedient as a mirror, continues to reflect those assumptions in form. It is not punishing you. It is expressing you. This is why effort so often fails, because outer effort cannot permanently overcome an inner identity. You may force an action for a while. You may temporarily perform confidence, abundance, worthiness, but if the inner state remains untouched, reality will slowly reorganize around the deeper assumption. The old pattern returns, not because fate decreed it, but because consciousness remained the same. You are not here to manipulate appearances. You are here to occupy states. A state is like an inner room. Step into it, and everything looks different from within it. The same world appears altered because the seer has changed. From one state, life seems hostile. From another, it seems responsive. From one state, delay feels like rejection. From another, it feels like movement. From one state, you react. From another, you create. Are you trying to change reality or your state? That is the real question. Because once the state changes, the script changes. The actors may look the same for a moment. The stage may appear unchanged. But the meaning has shifted. The bridge of events is already forming, even if you cannot yet see its shape. And the one who knows this does not beg the world for evidence every hour. They remain faithful to the unseen because they understand that consciousness moves first, appearances second. You were never meant to live as a beggar before life. You were meant to awaken as its source. The difficulty is not that you cannot imagine. The difficulty is that you imagine all day without honoring imagination as cause. You imagine when you fear. You imagine when you remember. You imagine when you anticipate. You imagine when you replay a conversation that has not happened yet. You imagine when you picture being rejected before you speak. You imagine when you expect delay before you begin. You imagine when you assume people see you as less than you are. So the question is not whether you are using imagination. The question is whether you are using it consciously. Because imagination, left unattended, becomes habit. And habit becomes identity. And identity becomes the reality you meet again and again until you finally become aware of the one meeting it. This is why the inner life matters more than appearances. A person may look disciplined on the outside and still be inwardly rehearsing failure. They may speak positively and still feel secretly disqualified. They may perform ambition while remaining faithful to limitation. And then they wonder why life will not move. But life is not moved by performance. It is moved by embodiment. You do not become what you occasionally think about. You become what you consent to as yourself. There is something almost too simple about this, which is why the mind resists it. It wants a method more complex, more ceremonial, more impressive. It wants something it can blame if results do not come. But reality is not built by complexity. It is built by assumption. Assumption is the invisible architecture of experience. What you assume to be true about yourself, others, time, opportunity, love, money, health, worth, possibility, all of it becomes the atmosphere through which you live. An atmosphere is not trivial. Atmosphere determines what feels natural. What feels natural is what you sustain. What you sustain hardens into fact. This is why trying is often the hidden enemy. Trying usually means you are still outside the state, reaching toward it. Being means you have entered, and once you enter, the tone changes. A person trying to be loved is anxious, strategic, observant, wounded by every delay. A person being loved moves differently. They are not performing to secure affection. They are expressing a state already assumed. A person trying to be wealthy watches every sign with fear. A person being wealthy may still act prudently, but inwardly they do not feel at the mercy of life. A person trying to become worthy seeks permission. A person being worthy has already withdrawn that request. Wanting asks the world for evidence. Being gives the world instruction. This is why the imaginal act must be more than visual. Many people visualize and remain unchanged because they treat the scene as something observed from a distance. They watch it the way they might watch a film. They admire it, they hope for it, they perhaps even enjoy it, but they do not enter it. And if you do not enter the state, you do not become the one to whom that scene belongs. The imaginal act is not successful because you saw an image. It becomes effective when you feel the inward shift of identity. You are not looking at a desired life. You are moving into it. This movement is subtle, but unmistakable when done correctly. It feels less like effort and more like settling, less like grasping and more like occupying, less like wishing and more like recognition. Something in you stops straining. Something stops negotiating with appearances. You become inwardly still, not because the world has changed yet, but because you have. What if nothing needs to change except you? That question unsettles the old self because the old self survived by reacting. It wants to remain the observer of circumstances, the victim of timing, the interpreter of external signs. But once you realize that consciousness is the source, the old excuses begin to lose their power. You cannot keep saying life is happening to you in the same way. You begin to see that what you repeatedly meet is often what you repeatedly are. This is not blame, it is authorship. And authorship is not a burden once you understand it. It is relief. Because if the source is within, then the change is available now. Not after the approval arrives. Not after someone apologizes. Not after the bank balance shifts. Not after a door opens. Now, you can enter a different state in this moment. You can decide that the old room no longer belongs to you. Think of it this way. Every state is a script. And every script carries its own conversations, reactions, expectations, and outcomes. Enter the state of abandonment, and you will interpret silence as rejection, distance as danger, ambiguity as loss. Enter the state of being chosen, and the same events no longer have the same meaning. The script changes because the actor has changed roles. The outer world is not fixed in the way you think. It is fluid to consciousness, but solid to unconsciousness. When you are unaware, reality feels heavy, given, immovable. When you become aware of state, you begin to see that the world is more like an echo chamber than a prison. It repeats your assumptions until you either call that destiny or wake up and change the sound. Are you waiting or already being? Most waiting is disguised unbelief. It says, I will feel secure when the thing arrives. It says, I will relax when the proof comes. It says, I will believe when circumstances give me permission. But that is backward. Circumstances do not authorize the state. The state authorizes the circumstances. This does not mean you deny facts in a childish way. It means you stop kneeling before them as final. Facts are shadows of prior states. They are the delayed print of earlier assumptions. Respect them if you must, but do not worship them. Do not let yesterday's projection decide today's identity. The mind that understands this begins to live differently. It becomes selective. It becomes inwardly disciplined. It no longer feeds on every fearful possibility, every dark prediction, every borrowed opinion. It realizes that to entertain a state is to invite its reflection. So it asks more carefully, what am I rehearsing inwardly? What role am I consenting to? What identity am I making natural through repetition? Because repetition matters. Not the repetition of empty affirmations spoken against your own feeling, but the repetition of returning again and again to the chosen state until it feels less like fiction and more like home, until the old self begins to loosen, until the new identity no longer feels dramatic but obvious. This is the secret few are willing to live by. Reality bends around what feels natural to consciousness. So the work is not to force outcomes. The work is to make the fulfilled state feel like self. That is why the inward question matters more than the outward strategy. Not how will it happen, but who am I now that it is done? And if you stay with that long enough, deeply enough, honestly enough, something begins to reorganize. Thoughts change, reactions change. What you notice changes, what you accept changes. The bridge of incidents begins not because you manipulated the world, but because the world is responding to the rearrangement within you. The reflection has no choice. It must follow the face. There's a moment very quiet, almost unnoticed, where imagining stops being something you do and becomes something you are. And that is the turning point. Until that moment, you may still be treating imagination like a tool, something you pick up when you need it and put down when you don't. You visit it in short bursts. You try it, evaluate it, question it, abandon it, return to it again. You stand outside of it, measuring its effectiveness, wondering if it's working. But the shift happens when you no longer step in and out. You remain. Because you realize you have never stopped imagining. Even your doubt is imagined. Even your delay is imagined. Even your this isn't working is imagined. So the real question becomes almost unsettling in its simplicity. If imagination is always active, then what exactly have you been imagining as true? Most people do not lack imagination. They lack awareness of what they are consenting to as reality. And once you see that, you begin to understand something deeper. You are not trying to create something new. You are selecting a state that already exists and entering it. Every version of you already exists as a state. The version who is confident, the version who is loved, the version who is successful, the version who is free, the version who is at peace, and also the version who doubts, the version who hesitates, the version who expects loss, the version who feels unseen, the version who remains stuck. These are not future possibilities waiting to happen. They are present states waiting to be occupied. So when you say, I want to become, you are often still thinking in time. But creation is not about becoming over time. It is about identifying now. You do not become the state, you enter it. And entry is not physical, it is psychological. It is emotional, it is imaginal. It is the quiet decision to stop being one version and to assume another. Are you trying to change reality or your state? Because if you are still trying to force the outer world to rearrange before you change, you will always feel behind. You will always feel like you're chasing something that keeps moving. You will always feel like you are almost there but not quite. But if you reverse it, if you change the state first, something begins to stabilize. You are no longer chasing the reflection. You are becoming the source. And from that place, you begin to understand something that cannot be taught. Only recognize the outer world is delayed. Not in a frustrating way, but in a faithful way. It is always catching up to what you have already assumed. This is why persistence matters. Not because you are convincing reality to obey you, but because you are stabilizing yourself in the state long enough for it to feel natural. Because once something feels natural, it no longer feels like effort. And once it no longer feels like effort, you stop checking. And once you stop checking, you stop interfering. And once you stop interfering, reality moves quietly, precisely, inevitably. But here is where most people turn back. They enter the state briefly. They feel it for a moment. Then they return to the old identity the moment the world does not immediately reflect it. They say, it didn't work. But what they mean is, I did not remain. Because imagination does not fail. Only abandonment does. Assumption, if persisted in, hardens into fact. Not because of belief in the emotional sense, but because of continuity. You do not need to feel excited all the time. You do not need to feel certain every second. You do not need to eliminate every doubt. You only need to return again and again and again until the new state feels more like you than the old one. That is when the shift becomes irreversible. If it were already yours, how would you feel? This question is not meant to be answered once. It is meant to be lived. Because every time you return to that feeling, you are stepping into the state. Every time you feel it as real, you are reinforcing identity. Every time you rest in it, you are loosening the old self. And eventually, something subtle happens. You stop asking the question. Because you are no longer imagining as if. You are imagining from. And that is the difference between hoping and knowing. between visualizing and embodying, between wishing and being. This is what it means to dwell. To dwell is not to visit. To dwell is to remain. To live in the end is not to occasionally think about the outcome. It is to make that outcome your psychological residence, so that even when the world shows you something else, you do not move. Not out of stubbornness, but out of identity. Because identity does not negotiate with appearances. It expresses itself through them. And this is where imagination reveals its true nature. It is not reacting to the world, it is preceding it. It is not shaped by circumstances, it is shaping them. It is not secondary, it is causal. So the question becomes more precise now. What are you dwelling in? Not what do you want, not what do you say, not what do you hope. What are you dwelling in? Because wherever you dwell, you will eventually arrive. Not by effort, not by chance, but by reflection. The world will rearrange itself, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, to mirror the state you have made home. And when it does, it will feel natural, not miraculous, because you will recognize it. You will see it and think, this is exactly what I have been being. And in that moment, you will understand something you could not have been convinced of before. You were never waiting for reality to change. Reality was waiting for you to remain. There is a tendency in the mind to ask how the change will happen, as though the path must be known before the state can be assumed. But the moment you ask how, you quietly step out of the state. Because the one who already is does not ask how to become. They are. This is why the mind struggles here. It has been trained to move from cause to effect through visible steps. It trusts process, sequence, logic. It wants to map the journey before it takes a step. It wants assurance before identity. It wants evidence before embodiment. But imagination does not operate in that direction. It begins at the end, not because it ignores the middle, but because the middle rearranges itself once the end is accepted. So when you assume a state, truly assume it, you are not skipping reality. You are selecting it. You are choosing a version of life and stepping into the identity that corresponds to it. And from that identity, actions will come, thoughts will come, opportunities will come, conversations will come, but they will not feel forced. They will feel like extensions of who you already are. This is what is often called the bridge of incidents. Not a plan you design, but a sequence that unfolds. And it rarely looks like what you would have chosen consciously. Sometimes it looks like loss. Sometimes it looks like delay. Sometimes it looks like confusion. But these are only appearances viewed from the old state. From the new state, they are movement. If you remain faithful to the assumption, even events that seem to contradict it are actually rearranging you into alignment with it. This is why you cannot judge too quickly, because the outer world is still reflecting the previous state for a time. And if you react to that reflection, you reinforce it. Are you reacting or creating? That question becomes essential here, because reaction belongs to the past. Creation belongs to the present. If you react, you are confirming what has already been. If you create, you are choosing what will be. But you cannot do both at the same time. So when something appears in your world that contradicts what you have assumed, a rejection, a delay, a loss, you are given a choice that is more important than the event itself. You can interpret it through the old identity, or you can remain in the new one. And remaining does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to redefine yourself because of it. Because the moment you say, this means it's not working, you have stepped out of the state, and the world will follow you there. But if you say nothing, if you remain inwardly still, if you continue to feel yourself as the one who already is, something begins to shift beneath the surface, quietly, unseen, inevitably. Because imagination does not argue with appearances. It replaces them. What if nothing needs to change except you? This question becomes more powerful here, because now you begin to see that even the so-called negative events are not obstacles in themselves. They are only obstacles if you identify with them. Otherwise, they are part of the bridge. And the bridge does not need your approval. It only needs your persistence. This is why you are told not to look for signs. Not because signs do not exist, but because looking for them pulls you out of the state. The one who is does not need reassurance. They do not wake up each morning asking, is it here yet? They wake up as it. And from that place, they move through the world differently. They do not chase opportunities. They recognize them. They do not force outcomes. They allow alignment. They do not beg for change. They embody it. If it were already yours, how would you feel? Would you be scanning every interaction for proof? Would you be measuring every day for progress? Would you be worried about timing? No. You would be settled. Not passive, but grounded. There is a quiet confidence that does not need to speak loudly. A certainty that does not need to defend itself. A knowing that does not need to convince others. And this is where imagination becomes almost invisible, because it is no longer something you are doing. It is something you are being. And from that being, reality begins to reorganize. Not always in ways that are comfortable at first, because comfort belongs to familiarity, and you are leaving the familiar behind. So there may be moments where the old identity tries to return, where doubt speaks louder, where the world seems unchanged, where time feels slow. But these are not signs of failure. They are invitations to remain, to return again to the state, to feel again from the end, to remember again who you have decided to be. Are you waiting or already being? Because waiting will always feel like distance, and being will always feel like presence. And presence has power, not because it forces the world, but because it defines it. This is the quiet authority of consciousness. It does not shout, it does not argue, it does not rush. It simply remains until the world reflects it. And it always does. Because the world has never been separate from you. It has only been responding to the version of you you agreed to be. So now the work becomes simpler. Not easier, but simpler. You no longer need to control everything. You no longer need to figure out every step. You no longer need to anticipate every outcome. You only need to remain faithful to the state you have chosen and allow reality to catch up, because it will. It always has. And it always will. The only question is, will you remain long enough to see it? There is something even more subtle than assuming a new state, and that is what you feed the state after you enter it. Because entering a state once is not difficult. Sustaining it is where identity is revealed. You can imagine a fulfilled life for a few moments. You can feel it, touch it, even believe it briefly. But then the day begins. You open your eyes. You move through familiar spaces. You see the same people, the same conditions, the same evidence that appears unchanged. And without noticing, you begin to feed the old state again. Not intentionally, but habitually, through what you accept, through what you dwell on, through what you repeat inwardly. This is why the inner conversation matters more than the outer one. Because even when you say nothing aloud, you are always speaking within. And that inner dialogue is not neutral, it is formative. If you enter the state of being successful, but continue to internally say, this is taking too long, nothing is changing, I hope this works, you are not dwelling in the new state. You are visiting it, then returning to the old one through language. Language is not just communication, it is reinforcement. What you say inwardly becomes what you accept as natural, and what is natural becomes what is real. So the question becomes sharper now. What are you telling yourself when no one is listening? Because that is the voice reality follows. This is why discipline is not about forcing behavior. It is about selecting thought, not rigidly, not anxiously, but deliberately. You begin to notice when the old identity speaks. You do not fight it. You do not panic. You simply do not agree with it. You return again and again and again. This return is the quiet work no one sees. It is not dramatic. It is not visible. But it is decisive, because every time you return to the chosen state, you weaken the old one. And eventually, the old state no longer feels like you. It begins to feel foreign, unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And that is when the shift is close, because what once felt natural now feels out of place. And what once felt imagined now feels like self. Are you trying to change reality or your state? Because if you are still trying to force outcomes, you will become exhausted. But if you focus on remaining in the state, something interesting happens. You stop reacting to everything. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer need to interpret every event. You begin to see that most reactions are unnecessary. They are echoes of old assumptions. They are habits of identity. They are not required. So you begin to move differently. You speak less from fear. You observe more without judgment. You feel less urgency to fix everything because you understand something deeper. Reality is not something you must manage. It is something you must reflect. And reflection is not controlled through effort. It is controlled through identity. This is where many people make a mistake. They think they must constantly visualize, constantly affirm, constantly do something to keep the process alive. But the process is always alive. You do not need to keep it going. You only need to stop interrupting it. An interruption comes from doubt, from contradiction, from returning to the old self the moment something feels uncertain. But uncertainty is not the enemy. It is simply the space where the old identity has not yet been replaced by the new one. So instead of filling that space with fear, you fill it with assumption, quietly, without force, without desperation. Just a steady return to the feeling of already being. If it were already yours, how would you feel? Would you be trying this hard? Would you be checking this often? Would you be questioning this much? No. You would be resting in it. And that rest is not passive. It is powerful, because it signals to consciousness, this is who I am now. And once that signal becomes consistent, reality reorganizes. Not because you pushed it, but because you stopped contradicting it. There is also something else that must be understood. You are not the only one in your world, but everyone in your world is responding to your state. Not in a mystical way, but in a reflective one. People do not see you as you try to present yourself. They see you as you feel yourself to be. If you feel overlooked, you will be overlooked. If you feel valued, you will be valued. If you feel uncertain, you will be treated with uncertainty. If you feel chosen, you will be chosen. Because perception is not independent, it is aligned. The world is not separate observers reacting randomly. It is a coordinated reflection of consciousness. This is what it means when it is said that others are yourself pushed out. Not that they are unreal, but that their behavior toward you reflects your assumption of self. So if you change the assumption, the reflection changes. Not always immediately, but inevitably. This is why you do not need to manipulate others. You do not need to convince them. You do not need to control outcomes. You only need to change the state from which you relate. And then allow the world to mirror it. What are you assuming right now? Not about life, about yourself. Because that is the root. Everything else rose from there. If you assume you are the one who always struggles, life will give you reasons to continue that story. If you assume you are the one who rises, life will reorganize to support that identity. And once you see this, you begin to take responsibility in a different way. Not as blame, but as authorship. You realize that you have been writing the script even when you thought you were just reading it. And now you can choose differently. Not once, but consistently. Not loudly, but quietly. Not forcefully, but faithfully. Because identity is not declared once, it is lived repeatedly. And whatever you live, you become. There comes a point where the question is no longer, can this work? But am I willing to remain? Because by now, you have seen enough to sense the pattern. You have noticed how quickly the mind returns to what is familiar, how easily it replays old stories, how naturally it reaches for the identity it has worn the longest. And this is where most people quietly stop. Not because they lack understanding, but because they lack persistence in identity. They enter the new state and then leave it the moment it is not confirmed. They assume and then abandon. They feel and then doubt. They begin and then return. And each return is not neutral. It is a reinforcement. Because every time you go back to the old self, you are saying, this is still who I am. And reality listens to that. Not to your words, not to your intentions, but to your consistency. Because consistency reveals identity. And identity determines experience. So the work becomes more refined now. Less about trying to feel something and more about refusing to leave it. You are no longer experimenting. You are choosing. You are no longer asking if it is possible. You are deciding who you are. And that decision must be lived, especially when nothing seems to reflect it yet. Because this is where the illusion feels strongest. The world appears unchanged. The evidence seems absent. The old conditions still surround you. And the mind begins to whisper, maybe this isn't real. Maybe I'm just imagining. Maybe I need something else. But notice what that is. It is the old identity asking to be believed again. Are you waiting or already being? Because waiting will always search for proof, and being will remain without it. This is the test. Not a test imposed from outside, but a natural threshold. The moment where you either return to the old self or remain in the new one long enough for it to take root. And taking root is not dramatic. It is subtle. It feels like stability, like a quiet knowing that does not need to be repeated constantly, like a sense of identity that no longer feels fragile. You are not reminding yourself every minute. You are resting as it. And from that rest, something begins to happen. You stop reacting to every contradiction. You stop interpreting every delay. You stop giving meaning to every absence. Because you understand something now. The outer world is not informing you. It is reflecting you. So you no longer read it for instruction. You read it as confirmation of past states, and you remain faithful to the current one. This is what dissolves fear. Not forcing yourself to be fearless, but realizing that fear is just another imagined state. It is a projection of a future you do not choose. And the moment you see that, you are no longer trapped in it. You can feel it without becoming it. You can observe it without agreeing with it. And then you return again to the chosen state. If it were already yours, how would you feel? Not excited, not overwhelmed, but natural. That word matters more than anything, natural, because reality conforms to what feels natural, not what feels intense. You can feel something strongly for a moment and still not accept it as true. But when something feels natural, you stop questioning it. You stop checking it. You stop trying to maintain it. It maintains itself. This is why repetition is not about force. It is about familiarity. You are making the new state familiar until it becomes the default, until it becomes the place your mind returns to without effort, until it becomes you. This is also where responsibility deepens, because now you see clearly. You cannot unknow this. You cannot go back to believing that life is random. You cannot fully return to the idea that circumstances control you. You have seen the mechanism. You have felt the shift. You have recognized the pattern. And now even if you fall back into old thinking, part of you knows this is not fixed. This is not final. This is not me unless I remain it. And that knowing changes everything, because it removes the sense of helplessness. It replaces it with authorship. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. You begin to see that every moment is an opportunity to select again. Not in panic, not in urgency, but in awareness. You notice the thought, you notice the feeling, and you ask, what state does this belong to? And if it is not the one you have chosen, you do not follow it. You return. This return becomes easier over time, not because the world changes immediately, but because you do. You begin to trust the process, not blindly, but experientially. You have seen enough to know. If I remain, it must reflect, not maybe, not sometimes, but always, because the world has no choice. It is not independent of consciousness, it is shaped by it. So the question is no longer about possibility, it is about fidelity. Will you remain faithful to the unseen long enough for it to be seen? Because that is where transformation completes. Not in the moment you imagine, but in the moment you no longer leave. At some point, something becomes unmistakably clear. You are not trying to get something from life. You are allowing life to express what you have become. And that shift is everything. Because as long as you are trying to get, you are still positioned as separate. You are still negotiating with reality. You are still measuring distance between where you are and where you want to be. And that distance becomes your experience. But when you move into being, there is no distance. There is only expression. You are not moving toward a future. You are selecting a present. And that present, once assumed, begins to unfold in what appears to be time. But time is not creating it. It is revealing it. This is why impatience dissolves when you understand this deeply. Impatience is the feeling that something is not yet yours. But if you have truly assumed it, if you have entered the state, if you are living from it, then what is there to be impatient about? You are not waiting for it. You are allowing it. And allowing is not passive. It is aligned. It is the absence of contradiction. It is the refusal to return to the old identity just because the world has not caught up yet. Are you trying or are you being? Because trying still carries effort, tension, uncertainty. Being carries stillness. Not inactivity, but certainty. A certainty that does not need to announce itself. A certainty that does not need to prove itself. A certainty that simply remains. This is where imagination becomes something entirely different. It is no longer a practice. It is a position from which you experience life, a position from which everything is filtered. And from that position, the world begins to feel different. Even before it looks different, you walk differently, you respond differently, you interpret differently. Not because you are forcing yourself to behave in a certain way, but because the state you occupy naturally expresses itself. This is what makes the change sustainable, because it is not based on effort. It is based on identity. And identity does not require maintenance. Once it is accepted, it simply is. What are you assuming right now? Not occasionally, not when you remember, but consistently. Because consistency is what turns imagination into reality. Not intensity, not occasional belief, but sustained assumption. This is also where something deeper begins to unfold. You start to see that the world is not filled with separate individuals acting independently. You begin to notice patterns, reflections, echoes. You begin to see how people respond to you in ways that mirror your inner state. Not always, obviously, but unmistakably over time. And then a realization begins to emerge. There is no other in the way you once thought. There are reflections, expressions, extensions of the state you are in. This does not mean people are unreal. It means their role in your experience is shaped by your assumption. So if you assume rejection, you will meet it. If you assume acceptance, you will meet that. If you assume indifference, you will meet that, because the world is not deciding who you are. It is responding to who you are being. And once you see this, something shifts in how you relate to others. You stop trying to control them. You stop trying to change them. You stop trying to get something from them. And instead, you change the state from which you see them. And when you do that, they change. Not because you force them, but because the reflection has adjusted. This is what it means to use imagination lovingly, not to manipulate, but to elevate, to see others as you would wish them to be, to assume the best, to feel the desired outcome as already true for them, and then allow reality to mirror that assumption, because what you assume about others is still an assumption within you, and it still creates. If it were already yours, how would you feel? Would you feel threatened? Would you feel competitive? Would you feel lacking? No. You would feel secure. And from that security, you would naturally extend that same assumption outward. This is where imagination becomes not just creative, but transformative. Because now it is not only shaping your experience, it is shaping the experience of those around you. And this is where responsibility becomes deeper, not heavier, but more meaningful, because you begin to see that every thought is not isolated. Every assumption is not contained. It is expressed, it is projected, it is lived. So you become more aware, not anxious, but intentional. You choose more carefully what you dwell in, because you know whatever you dwell in, you will meet. And this is where the final illusion begins to dissolve. The illusion that you are separate from life, that you're observing something external, that you are reacting to something outside of you. Because now you see, you are not in the world. The world is in you, not physically, but in consciousness. It is your projection, your reflection, your echo. And once that is seen, even partially, you cannot go back to living the same way. Because now you know nothing is happening to you. It is happening through you. And that changes everything. There is one final resistance that remains. And it is the most subtle of all. It is the tendency to still give credit to the outer world, even after you begin to see the pattern, even after you notice the reflection, even after you experience shifts. There is still a quiet habit of saying it happened because of that person. It worked because of that opportunity. It changed because of that event. And without realizing it, you return the power to appearances. You begin to trace outcomes back to visible causes, instead of recognizing the invisible origin. But appearances are never the cause. They are the expression. They are the bridge. They are the unfolding of what has already been assumed. And if you mistake the bridge for the cause, you lose awareness of your own creative power. Because then you begin to depend on circumstances again. You begin to wait for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity. And you forget that all of these are responses, not origins. This is why the mind clings to stories. Because stories give a logical sequence. They make events feel explainable. But reality is not assembled from the outside in. It is projected from the inside out. So when something unfolds in your life, and it appears that a certain event caused it, pause and ask yourself, what did I assume before this appeared? Because that is where the movement began. Not in the visible step, but in the invisible state. Are you reacting or creating? Because if you continue to react to appearances as causes, you will always feel like life is happening to you. But if you recognize them as reflections, you begin to see the continuity, the coherence, the quiet precision of how reality rearranges itself around identity. And then something else becomes clear. You do not need to force the middle. You do not need to manage the sequence. You do not need to understand every step, because the steps are not your responsibility. The state is. And once the state is assumed, the steps appear naturally, unexpectedly. often in ways that would have seemed impossible from the old perspective. This is what is meant by the bridge of incidents. Not a path you plan, but a path that reveals itself. And sometimes that path will look completely unrelated to your desire. It may even seem contradictory, but only if you are still looking from the old state. From the new state, everything makes sense. Even the things that once seemed like setbacks, even the moments that felt like loss, even the events that appeared to delay you. Because now, you see, they were repositioning you. They were aligning you. They were moving you into place, not against your desire, but toward it. What if nothing needs to change except you? This question now becomes undeniable, because you begin to see that every attempt to control the outer world was misplaced effort. You were trying to rearrange reflections. Instead of selecting the image, you were trying to fix outcomes instead of embodying the cause. And now that you see it, you no longer need to struggle the same way. You no longer need to push. You no longer need to force. You no longer need to convince. You simply assume and remain and allow. This does not mean you become passive. It means your action becomes aligned. It becomes natural. It becomes effortless in the sense that it flows from identity, not from desperation. Because the one who already is does not act to become. They act as expression. This is the difference between effort and alignment. Effort tries to produce. Alignment expresses. And expression is always more powerful because it is rooted in identity. If it were already yours, how would you feel? You would not be trying to control every detail. You would not be anxious about every outcome. You would not be questioning every step. You would be moving through life with a quiet certainty that everything is unfolding as it must. Not because of fate, not because of luck, but because of the state you have assumed. And this is where the final realization begins to settle. Not as an idea, but as a knowing. You were never separate from the power you were seeking. You were never outside of creation. You were never waiting for something to give you permission. You were always the source. You were always the one imagining. You were always the one assuming. You were always the one selecting the state. And the world has always been reflecting it. So now, there is nothing left to figure out. Only something to accept and to live. Not occasionally. Not when it feels easy. But consistently. Quietly. Faithfully. Because once you truly see this, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to believing that life is random. You cannot fully return to the idea that you are powerless. You cannot pretend that imagination is just fantasy. You know now that it is creation. And that knowing changes everything. Not all at once, but completely. You were never waiting for reality to change. Reality was waiting for you.